Hello, Professor Laird here, and this is the video lecture for Chapter 11 for the Intro to Politics class. We'll be looking at political parties. Now, first of all, let's talk about what the purpose of the political party is, and interestingly enough, these were not initially intended to be part of our political system. When we look at what the framers of our Constitution did to try to eliminate the violence of factions. Madison considered political parties just another type of a faction, but they tended to just naturally form anyway, and they serve some useful purposes, even though there are some drawbacks to political parties. They are somewhat of an inevitable development of human beings in the political system. Here we're looking at the formal organization that has the purpose of winning control of the government, because whoever has control of the government will influence the direction that country will go, particularly in the policies, the type of policies that it will pass, and for maintaining the power over government, influencing, like I said, the direction of policy for that country. They also bear the cost of bringing people together to form a constituency that is going to be a useful mechanism for people to use to determine the direction they want government to go. Therefore, the party provides a clear choice of who the voter can select, and you could say that there's somewhat of a prepackaged ideology that goes with that makes it a little bit simpler for people to decide on who they're going to vote for, and therefore the party takes that role of nominating and recruiting candidates to carry their banner forward to provide this ideology that people will eventually vote for. As I said before, democracies, which the purpose of the democracy, of course, was to choose our own leaders, select our representatives, and to have a say in determining the direction that our country goes. Before democracies, leaders were pretty much born into the role, or they took over the role through strength, power, or they bought their way to the office through bribery or through appointments. Once the democracy started to become the preferred route, in general, we are seeing a pushback against democracies, even though elections are still a form of establishing democracy. There's a pushback in some of the other things that democracy has brought to us. Once the elections have been set up, then these clubs, or what they were originally considered factions, they form into nationwide organizations and raise money for the purpose of getting their candidates into office. And as voting rights, suffrage expanded, candidates began to rely more and more on the aid that this election agent could provide for them. In the United States, once those parties started to form and determine the direction that elections would go, the parties had considerable amount of control over that. The parties actually printed their own ballot and then recruited people to vote for them. So therefore, prior to the late 1800s, when people went to the voting box, everybody knew who they were going to vote for because they had to get that party's ballot and then go take it to the ballot box. They changed the system in the late 1800s where there was a uniform ballot that had all the candidates on one piece of paper, and it was a secret ballot. It took a lot of the control of the political parties out of the elections once they started to do that. Another thing that the party functions to do is to mobilize the masses, to get them to vote. They want to stimulate their voters to go to the polls. We have already talked about this in the previous class. With respect to elections and low voter turnout, parties aren't necessarily driven to stimulate total voter turnout. They're trying to stimulate their voters to go to the polls, and could literally be trying to suppress other voters who they suspect would not vote for them. And therefore, they can use this mobilization to generate a show of support for the government, which is a healthy part of democracy. So we have to kind of keep this in mind, that parties evolved inevitably from this process of people wanting to get involved in government. And because we're such a group of species, they pretty much formed out of necessity to a certain degree, and to meet certain crises, as I've said before. With joining a group or being the member of a group, you have strength in numbers. So therefore, you can face these crises and handle these problems and raise more funds and have more resources when you build a big party that is designed to do this sort of thing. One of the things that parties do is recruit their future leaders, socialization of leaders. Now, the party doesn't necessarily do this all by itself, because each generation could be particularly socialized into following a party, and then that father will pass those down to their sons and daughters as far as who they're going to vote for when they grow up. There's no guarantee on that, but that's kind of how it works. But the party also serves to do that on the local levels. There's party organizations that anybody can go join and help build that party's platform on the local level, and then that could actually then be translated to the state level, which then could go to the national level. But we'll look in, this is not the only class, but in a couple other classes, we'll look at the differences between the British system and the U.S. system, considering our similarities, but there's some interesting divergences there. In the British system, it's more of a farm team type system, where future politicians, future leaders, they start from the lower ranks, from lesser tasks to a nomination from a district, could be to a faithful party voter and a spokesperson, and then perhaps to winning an interim election as a party leader. Look at Margaret Thatcher's rise to the top. She was a local official, and then gained some notoriety as far as getting things done at the local level, then worked her way up through the ranks, and then became the leader of her particular party. In the United States, interestingly enough, despite our polarization, the parties are somewhat weaker organizationally, because they don't have quite the same grassroots on up type appeal. Because as we've seen in the United States, somebody who is perhaps has name recognition, they could literally declare in one day, they say, okay, now I want to run for this party, and they could get elected president the next day. So it's not quite the same as far as the farm team type system. The parties in this case have primaries, provide somewhat of a playoff type system to get to the final candidates. The parties have their primaries to determine who they're going to run in the general elections. In a one-party state, such as China, there is restricted membership in that party. China's Communist Party entails only about 5% of the total population. So it's kind of an elite group, and there is an accumulation of wealth in that Communist Party now that it has engaged in global capitalism. And their meetings are rather secretive as to how they get things done and who they determine the party leaders are going to be. Party also provides that source of political identity, because particularly in the United States, it's very difficult to get elected on a statewide in particular, and certainly a national-wide office, without having one of those two big parties behind you. And I've already mentioned before that party loyalty is the strongest predictor of who someone will vote for. About 2/3 of the entire country, we already know who they're going to vote for, regardless of who's running. So therefore, it contributes to the formation of a political community that, even on a national scale, it has a sense of solidarity that can bring people together as a political identity. And I've mentioned this before, that we are seemingly more polarized than we have been in past years as a result of that party identity, or an ideological identity of being conservative or liberal. This is quite often passed on from parents. As I've said before, you're kind of socialized into these ideological preferences, and that could potentially sustain over the long term, and the party loyalty stays strong over the long haul. Party also provides a channel of control, particularly certain punishments and rewards, as far as some favoritism, or the party might put some more of their resources in one particular election than another. Loyalty is rewarded, that maintaining that party line. In order to get control of government, you actually have to have a solidarity of that party. Otherwise, having the majority of that particular chamber doesn't mean anything unless all the party members vote together in block. So could be potential punishments and rewards if that loyalty isn't maintained. Particularly, the party can nominate certain offices within the party. One of the most important parts of the legislative activity there is the committees. Most, in particular in the United States, we'll talk about this in more detail later, a lot of the work gets done in committees in the American system, and therefore being assigned to a particular committee, you could get rewarded through that as well. It's another way of rewarding people, is giving them a committee assignment that they prefer, or particularly if you get assigned to be the chairman of a committee. That's a pretty big deal, because that gives you some gatekeeping power there. So this support for the favored legislation, this log rolling, this is where wheeling and dealing can get done within a party, particularly to help your local constituents. You might wheel and deal with other party members that from different regions of the country, in order to try to come together on a platform that the entire party's going to agree on, to maintain that solidarity, and to, once they get the majority, then they will be able to pass legislation. Being a member of that party and keeping that loyalty, kind of towing the line there, that gives you more of a chance to advance to these powerful positions. It's kind of what is referred to as seniority. So if you keep getting reelected and following the party line, then eventually you could get appointed or selected for higher and more important positions. Again, another quick comparison here between the U.S. and U.K. Party organization in the U.S., as I said, is a little bit looser, a little bit more informal. Does not really require a membership. You just have to state your loyalty to that platform. Some local orgs do collect dues locally here. This is particularly where I live, in Bergen County, New Jersey. There is a Bergen County Republican organization that you can get involved in, and there's also a Democratic committee of Bergen County that anybody can devote their time to those organizations and contribute to the legwork that they might need as far as helping with the local elections. Parties aren't quite as powerful on the local level, because it's more of just a hands-on getting things done at the local level, at the city level. But as you get to the district and the statewide, particularly congressional districts that are going to Washington, yes, then the party membership really starts to matter more and more. In the UK, the members form their constituency organizations and determine local policy, and then they send delegates to the annual conference. There's some similarities there to the US, but in the UK they have what is called a central office that hires the local party agents. So it's more organized, more structured, and where you would actually, in a way, get employed by the party to work for the party and then use that to work up the party ladder there. They also have a management board that oversees the day-to-day operations. So more structured, more organized in the UK, but in the long run, still serving the same purposes as far as providing that solidarity in order to win control of the government and then have that majority where they can pass the policy that their ideology believes in. Looking at some examples of party systems, a one-party system, which we've touched on here and there. China is a one-party system. Cuba, Tanzania, Syria, Russia is pretty much devolving back into a one-party system of the Putin party. There's been some examples over the years, such as right-wing dictatorships, such as Nazi Germany, as well as Generalissimo Franco's Spain, right-wing party there, unopposed for the most part, so therefore they can mobilize what they need to and control the communication that gets out, might have a little bit more hold on what propaganda can get put out there to the public, because since they're trying to oppress any opposition, they have to make sure that everybody still, or at least favors this party that's in power, or provide the illusion that everything is under control and there's no need to organize any other parties. The dominant party system is where a single party holds power all the time. Now, this, you could argue, this is not real different from a single party authoritarian type system, but there are other parties. It's just that they can't seem to get traction. Mexico is a good example. The PRI party was in power for 70 years. There was other parties there, but the PRI had just really ensconced itself all the way down to the local levels, where the mayors and the local officials would make sure that to maintain that loyalty and that patronage system, those favors would get passed back down from the top party officials to reward that dedication and loyalty, to make sure that the party stays in power at the local level and then progresses up to the top from there. PRI won the election they had an election every 6 years, 60 to 70% of the vote. That started to dismantle back in the 80s when a couple of presidents decided not to handpick their successor and kind of just let it happen. And then by the year 2000, the PAN party took back in control. The PRI is still back into control, so they still have a lot of roots there that enables them to do that. The idea is that from the civil service on up, the people that work for the government are tied to the party as well. It has also been somewhat associated with independence movements, because whoever it is that spearheads that independence movement is going to have a lot of influence to start that government, and their influence is going to potentially provide the dominant parties, such as, for example, the party of Gandhi. When Gandhi spearheaded the independence movement in India, then the parties were starting to form. Gandhi had an enormous amount of influence. Of course, he was assassinated very early on, but his descendants, his followers, they had a very strong dominant party for quite a while. Perhaps when you're getting started, in order to establish some sort of stability, might not be a bad idea to have somewhat of a dominant party system to get things settled in, where you want to avoid as much of that internal disagreement as possible in order to get the new government situated. So that's, I guess, one of the reasons why that might tend to happen. United States, predominantly a two-party system, where they typically share over 90% of the votes, but neither of them typically receive more than 55 to 60% of the vote. So therefore, it can be the swing voters can really determine the election each time it comes around. And for that reason, neither party seems to hold power for very long because of that closeness of the elections between those two parties. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the two parties can provide another system of checks and balances on each other, knowing that if the electorate kind of gets tired of one party that's been in power for a couple of administrations, then those swing voters are going to shift back and put the other party back in power. That's kind of how it's worked in the United States for a long time. But in the U.S., since we are so polarized, it's so that when a party gets into power, they tend to want to undo what the previous administration did and then ram through their ideologically loaded policy until that other party gets back into power and then undoes what they do. That's not how it was intended, and that's not really how it operated for a long time. But if our polarization increases, then it's going to be somewhat dysfunctional rather than having a somewhat healthy system of checks and balances where one party is kind of checking the other. Then it could devolve into dysfunctional. But as a healthy checks and balances on each other, it could be fairly stable between those two parties. It served us well for quite a long time, and now we're starting to see some problematic elements here because of the polarization. When there's two parties, they have pressure to appeal to many different groups, and this is where it gets unhealthy, because if a party just says, well, forget about it, I'm not even going to try to appeal to anybody other than those that are loyal to my party, that's where the polarization starts to increase. Whereas in the past, each party literally tried to reach out and merge with as many as they could from the other party in order to try to bring some of them in order to win elections. That had worked fairly well. And as polarization increases, then parties are not even going to attempt to try to appeal to anyone other than those who are almost fanatically loyal to getting their party back into power. And one of the benefits of having the two-party system, as we talked about before with the coalitions that are needed in the multi-party systems, well, if one party has the majority, then there's no need to rely on those potentially unstable coalitions. But of course, then you've got to have that solidarity within your party. And these two-party systems are typical to the single-member district elections that we touched on. One of the reasons why we have a two-party system is because the single-member districts means that there's only one person that's being elected from that district. So therefore, there's only an incentive for two parties to vie for that one shot. Now, this is an interesting theory that's been studied for a long time. If you had more than one representative coming out of that district, you'd have more incentive for more parties. For example, if you had a district where there was 3 representatives that were going to be elected from that district, then you would have at least 4 political parties that would have an incentive to try to get elected, because those last 2 parties could still try to vie for that 3rd place. So if there are 5 members elected from a district, there's going to be an incentive for at least 6 parties. That's how it works. And if you only have 1 member elected from that district, there's only incentive for 2 parties for all practical purposes. There are third parties that come and go, but they don't sustain over time. The Electoral College, I've also mentioned, is conducive to a two-party system because it requires for the president to get a majority of electoral votes. So therefore, if you have 3 viable political parties that are running for president, the chances that you're going to not get a majority increase. That became evident very early on. Literally, the election of 1800 was a fiasco because of that very problem. And so they began to realize fairly quickly that we only need two major parties. Otherwise, this presidential election could get thrown into the House almost every time. So therefore, there's no incentive for a third party, because in order to win a majority, that's going to be more conducive if you just have two parties running. There's also the winner-take-all aspect, where whichever candidate gets the plurality of the state's popular vote, they're going to get all of that state's electoral votes. And that's why there is an occasional disconnect between popular vote and electoral vote. We've had 5 elections to where the candidate that had more of the popular vote did not win the election because they did not have a majority of the electoral votes. So that winner-take-all system, which all states have pretty much complied with doing over the years, each state has decided that on themselves to put all of their electoral votes up in one block. That makes them a more attractive target for the presidents to campaign to them or to appeal to them, because the president-elect or the candidate is going to get all of their electoral votes, not just a portion of them. So that actually gives the states a little bit more power in elections by putting all of their electoral votes together in block. Now, I've talked a little bit about gerrymandering, where the party in power, each 10 years, we've just gone through a census in 2020, and there's been some accusations of gerrymandering on both sides of the aisle, that the party in power at the state level, which is tasked with drawing those districts, they can scientifically use demographics and all kinds of mapping, very intricate mapping programs to try to maximize the chances of them staying in power, where they'll break up as many districts as they can to where they know their party's going to have the majority, and then they're going to pack or condense as few districts as possible that are going to have a massive majority of that one party. So that's called packing and cracking. They are trying to maximize the number of districts that are going to get a majority of their vote, and then minimize the number of districts that are going to have a majority vote of the other party. And that has been effective in a way, because there have been several elections over the last 15 years to where the party that has the most seats in Congress did not get the majority of the popular vote nationwide. Third parties have numerous obstacles to getting started. The major parties could actually absorb their platforms. The Democratic Party could be doing some of that to the Green Party or to a socialist leaning type party. The Democrats could potentially grab that. A libertarian leading party would be absorbed potentially into the conservative or the Republican Party. So that's how it's been done over the years. Third party is quite often a single issue party, and so therefore does not have enough power behind it to pull in more constituents, and is typically short-lived once that issue gets absorbed into the larger platforms. Each state has the potential, and that's literally because of the party in power at that state level, they can actually pass restrictions that make it more and more difficult for a third party to even get on the ballot. And then another issue here is that the swing voters are aware that if they do vote for that third party, they are wasting their vote, in the sense that they know that that party is not going to win. So therefore, that minimizes the number of swing voters out there, because then most people will just go ahead and vote for one of the major parties, because at least they know that their vote could potentially pick the winner. So that's another interesting dilemma that we have in the United States with our two-party system. Here's an example of the congressional district. This is one in Maryland where This is actually one district, and you can zoom in on this, and you can see that it is actually it is connected. There's not a place here. Of course, now it crosses a channel right there, but this entire district is connected for the most part, but it was designed in order to try to maximize as many of the same party into that one district. A multi-party system that we've already touched on as well, more than two major parties. Norway, for example, has about 7 parties in their Congress, and they 169 seats. And recently, 3 parties formed a coalition of 86 seats. This is, as I said, typical with proportional representation type of elections where you have a wider range of choice. And then through the coalitions, the smaller parties can actually share some of the power. So you've got pros and cons, costs and benefits on both sides of these types of systems here. Again, it's going to rely on the constituency itself getting smarter and aware of what the problems are in society, and electing smarter people in order to try to solve problems. So it kind of all emanates from that in these democratic systems. But there are some interesting differences here where even though it may sound useful to have smaller parties to become into a coalition, so therefore you can have some interesting combinations of platforms that can come together that may not normally come together in just a two-party system. However, coalitions can be unstable. Got some examples there. Italy has been governed by 62 different coalitions since 1945. So some difficulty there keeping coalitions together. Now, as far as party finance, members can typically pay dues if it's so inclined. In the United States, that's not normally the way that it's done. Normally it's through donations from individuals and interest groups. Particularly the wealthier, the higher income, provide a much larger share of the campaign finance to the parties. Public finance, which has not really gone over very well in the United States, this is where the government decides to have the taxpayers contribute some of their taxes to provide somewhat of a more equal share of the public finance that all candidates can tap into. That has not been satisfactory for the most part in the United States, because candidates feel like that they can spend a lot more in order to get elected. Those are some difficulties that we have in the United States with increasing amount of money getting infused into the political system. But public finance would lessen some of that dependence on other sources, but obviously they're not going to be able to get as much money. So there's going to be some other things that are going to have to shift. If a country wants to go to public finance, they're going to have to also, the candidates are going to figure out how to get elected spending less money or spending equally the same amounts of money. That would be one of the bigger challenges. The single party, like I said, uses a lot of that patronage, kickbacks, rewarding with jobs in return for that public support. And then some states provide government subsidies to finance their parties, particularly party that is in power that might pass subsidies to further their own policies. There may be some problematic elements with that as far as favoritism. Some of that patronage might be going in there. In a country like the United States, they would have to perhaps agree with bipartisan policy that the government, kind of like approving public finance, it can be that kind of the same thing. They'd have to approve subsidies that might go out equally to the parties to help them finance their campaigns without relying on so much money coming from wealthy donors and corporations and things like that. So that would have to be something that the government would decide to do. Now, as far as how the party progresses, the leaders typically develop their own set of values. That's one of the reasons why parties change over time, is because they may not, the leaders, the oligopolistic system that we have, well, human nature has a tendency to be more oligopolistic. So the leaders are going to start to call their own shots, and the followers, or those that kind of bought into the party platform, may be kind of left behind. The leaders are kind of calling the shots and setting their own agenda. So then over the course of time, parties may shift. Followers could branch off into a different party, or perhaps an offshoot party. But the incentive, of course, is to grow the party as large as possible in order to try to win control of government and maintain that majority. Then, when it comes election time, you're trying to maximize your voters. Now, this is the ideal situation, because we're becoming so polarized, that this trying to find a moderate position in order to try to collect as many voters as you can, that may not be as much of an incentive as it used to be. The party could potentially disappoint those that are faithful to the original vision, so that's how parties can shift and change, and new parties may come in to replace old parties, or split from, or the old parties are become somewhat moderated. That we may be seeing an interesting transition here, particularly within the Republican Party, that has shown a somewhat of a divide between those that are loyal to the Donald Trump side of the Republican Party, and then there's a side of the Republican Party that kind of wants to distance themselves from Donald Trump. Whether or not they want to be a moderate party or not is not necessarily the issue. Right now they're just kind of wanting to distance themselves from Donald Trump. So that might be an interesting progression that we would see as well. All right, so that's what I wanted to talk about for political parties for Chapter 11. So stay tuned for discussion forum between now and the next class.